You think you understand a man when you've spent 3 years managing his life. Thea Dunbar knew Colton Morrow's coffee order, his resting fury, and the exact pitch his voice reached when he was about to obliterate someone in a deposition. She knew which of the senior partners were afraid of him, which judges respected him without liking him, and which opposing counsel had made the fatal mistake of underestimating him once and never recovered professionally. She had managed the man's entire existence from a mahogany desk on the 42nd floor for 3 years, and she had believed, with quiet confidence, that she was invisible to him. That was the arrangement. She kept his world running. He never asked why she stayed late. She never let him see anything except the precise, capable woman who handed him his espresso at 7:15 every morning. What she hadn't accounted for was February. The underground parking garage beneath the Morrow and Associates Tower smelled of rock salt and cold exhaust, and the particular damp that settled into Toronto concrete every winter like it intended to stay. It was 11:47 at night. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in that sickly way they always did after midnight, casting everything in a jaundiced yellow that made the few remaining cars look like relics from a bad dream. Colton had sent his driver home 3 hours ago. He preferred the quiet of the empty garage. He preferred the silence of doing things himself when the building was hollow. He saw her car before he reached his own. A 2009 Subaru Outback Silver parked in the far corner of the executive level where it had absolutely no business being. The rear bumper was held on with a bungee cord. The wheel wells were rusted through. It was the kind of car that announced its presence by being wrong. Wrong lot, wrong building, wrong city for a vehicle that old and that tired. Colton stopped walking. In his profession, anomalies were never innocent. He had spent 20 years learning to read a room, a document, and a parking garage with the same cold precision. His hand moved instinctively to his coat pocket, where his phone was, where building security was stored. He approached the car instead. The windows were completely fogged from the inside, not condensation from a cold engine. This was the deep rolling obscurity of breath. Someone was in there, breathing, and had been breathing there for a long time. Colton leaned forward and wiped a palm across the driver's side glass, clearing a rough circle. He looked inside. Curled in the back seat, tucked beneath a grey wool coat and what appeared to be a striped moving blanket, was Thea Dunbar, his executive assistant, the woman who ran his professional life with the quiet efficiency of a Swiss watch. She had her knees drawn to her chest, her dark hair loose and fanned out across a makeshift pillow that he recognized, after a moment, as a rolled-up blazer. Her blazer, the charcoal one she wore on Tuesdays. She was shivering. Even through the glass he could see it, the fine, constant trembling of someone who had been cold for too long. 3 times. Firm. The response was immediate and violent. Thea lurched upright, the blanket falling, her hands flying out in pure animal panic. Her eyes were wide and blank and terrified before they found him, and then the terror curdled into something worse. Mortification. She scrambled over the console into the driver's seat, jammed the key in the ignition, and rolled the window down exactly enough to speak through. Her voice was rough with cold and sleep, but she straightened her posture immediately, as though she was sitting at her desk upstairs rather than shivering in a rusted car at midnight. I was working late. I got tired. I didn't want to drive exhausted. It's -14 outside, Thea. The heater works. The car was off. She didn't answer that. He looked at the moving blanket. He looked at the blazer pillow. He looked at the small, battered duffel bag, visible on the back seat beside a stack of manila folders. This wasn't someone who had fallen asleep at the wheel of their plans. This was someone who had arrived. Where do you live? The question landed in the cold air between them. He watched the professional mask fracture, just for a second, just a hairline crack, before she sealed it. Leslieville, she said. Smooth, practiced. It's a long drive. I'll head home now. She shifted the car into reverse. Colton stepped back. He let her go. He stood in the empty garage for a long time after the taillights disappeared up the ramp, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath making small clouds in the freezing air. He had spent his entire career reading people under pressure. He had deposed witnesses who had rehearsed their lies for months. He had sat across from executives who had perfected their performance over decades. Thea hadn't been lying to protect herself. She'd been lying out of sheer, absolute shame. Those were different things entirely. By 7:15 the next morning, she was already at her desk. Espresso on his blotter, the morning briefings in the blue folder, the Hendricks arbitration files pulled and flagged, not a single hair out of place. The circles under her eyes had been carefully obscured. Her blazer, the one she'd slept on, was pressed and spotless. Colton said nothing, but he looked. He had spent 3 years taking Thea Dunbar for granted in the way you take reliable things for granted: clocks, elevators, competent people who show up. Now he looked at her the way he looked at a contract that had revealed a problem he'd previously skimmed past. Her heels were polished to a high gloss, but the leather was cracked at the toe of the left one. Her blazer was pressed, but the lining was fraying at the cuff. When the junior associate brought around the lunch order at noon, Thea smiled and said she wasn't hungry. At 1:30, he walked past her desk and saw a granola bar wrapper and a cup of hot water from the break room kettle. He went back into his office and called Nash, his head of building security. "Pull the parking garage footage," Colton said. "Executive level. Last month, I want to know how many nights the Subaru Outback didn't leave." Nash paused. "Are we looking at a security concern?" "Just the number. Call me." 40 minutes later, Nash called back. 26 nights, Nash said. "She brings it into the executive level after 7 p.m. when the lot clears. Takes it out before 6 a.m. parks on a side street during business hours. Brings it back in the evening." 26 nights, nearly a month. "Delete it," Colton said. "All of it. Nobody else sees it." He hung up and stood at his window, staring out at the grey February skyline. The CN Tower was barely visible through the cloud. The city was the same city it always was. Expensive, relentless, entirely indifferent. He hit the intercom. "Thea, my office." She came in with her notepad. She always came in with her notepad. "Close the door." She did. She stood in the center of the room, pen ready, face composed. Colton didn't sit. He walked around his desk and stopped a few feet from her. He was taller than her by nearly a foot, a fact that had never seemed relevant before. "You weren't tired last night, Thea." Her pen stopped. "You've been sleeping in the executive lot for 26 nights. The color left her face so completely and so fast that he thought, for a moment, she might actually fall. She didn't. She held herself upright through what appeared to be sheer, controlled fury. "I would prefer to keep my personal life. You work for me. That arrangement requires you to be functional, rested, and not vulnerable to being pressured by opposing counsel who figure out that my executive assistant is living out of a Subaru. That's not an invasion of your privacy. That's a professional liability." He kept his voice flat. "You're going to tell me what's happening, or I'm going to conclude that something is wrong enough that I need to let you go." It was a bluff. He had no intention of firing her, but he needed a lever, and that was the only one he had. She stared at him. Then the notepad hit his desk with a sharp crack. "A liability," she repeated. Her voice had gone very quiet and very precise, the way it did when she was managing something she was afraid of losing control of. "You think I'm selling your client files so I can sleep in a parking garage?" "I don't know what I think. That's why I'm asking." Thea crossed her arms over her chest. She looked away from him, toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawling grey and white below. When she finally spoke, the professionalism was entirely gone. "My brother," she said. His name was Jonah. He was 20 years old, and 2 years ago he had been working a construction job in Brampton. Summer work, saving for his second year at Ryerson, when a scaffolding failure sent him 6 meters to the ground, spinal cord injury, L1 through L3. He could not walk. He would not walk. He needed round-the-clock nursing care, physiotherapy twice a week to prevent muscle atrophy, and a facility equipped to manage his feeding tube and monitor his pressure sores. OHIP covered his acute care. It covered the first 8 months of rehabilitation. Then the assessors determined he had reached his functional plateau and discharged him to Thea's care. She worked 60 hours a week for Colton Morrow. She could not turn a 110-pound man every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. She could not administer his tube feeds and track his vitals and still make it to Bay Street by 7 a.m. So she paid. The private facility in Burlington cost $4,800 a month. Her take-home pay was $5,400. That left $600 for rent, food, transit, and existence in Toronto. She had managed it for 18 months by moving to a bachelor apartment in Weston, walking to the TTC rather than using her Presto card, eating whatever the break room offered, and skipping lunches. 3 weeks ago, the building had been sold to a development group. The new owners issued notices. Her rent was going to $1,800 a month effective March 1st. She had 2 weeks to comply or vacate. She could not comply. She vacated. "Why didn't you ask me for a raise?" His voice was very controlled. Thea looked at him directly. "Because you're Colton Morrow," she said. "You don't give things without conditions. I've watched you for 3 years. I know exactly what it means when someone owes you. I watched 3 different clients believe they were receiving help and discover later they were collateral. She held his gaze without flinching. I wasn't willing to be that person. The accuracy of it was like a hand flat against his sternum. She kept going. Her voice was steady and hard and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Jonah is in a clean room. He has nurses. He has physiotherapy. He can't speak, but he knows when I visit. He squeezes my hand. She lifted her chin slightly. That is what matters. Do the arithmetic however you want. Fire me if that's what this is. I'll find another job. I'll park somewhere else. Silence filled the entire 42nd floor. Colton Morrow had negotiated billion-dollar transactions. He had made grown men weep in depositions. He stood in his office, looking at the woman who had held his professional life together through 2 mergers and a malpractice review, and found himself entirely, profoundly without words. His money was clean on paper. Hers was soaked in sacrifice. "Sit down," he said finally. "I'd rather stand." He put his hands, carefully, without force, on her shoulders and guided her into the client chair. He did not go behind his desk. He crouched down in front of her, his tailored trousers creasing against the floor. He looked up into her guarded, exhausted eyes. "You're not fired," he said, "and you're never sleeping in that car again." He did not explain himself further. He walked her downstairs, put her in his car, and drove her to a furnished apartment in a building on Wellington Street that the firm kept for visiting clients and expert witnesses. He unlocked the door and stepped back without crossing the threshold. The apartment was warm. The windows faced south. The fridge was stocked, the floors were heated, and the bed had a duvet so thick it looked like a snowbank. "This is a security measure," Colton said from the doorway. "You have detailed knowledge of every active file in this firm. A person sleeping in their car is a person who can be pressured. This is a liability decision. You'll use it until further notice." He dropped a key card on the console table. "I'll see you at 7:15. He left before she could argue. He stood in the hallway for a long time, long enough to hear, through the heavy door, the sound of her crying, not quietly, not the way people cried when they wanted to be heard. The ugly, heaving release of someone who had been holding their breath for 18 months and had finally been allowed to stop. Colton took the elevator back to the garage and sat in his car without starting it for 20 minutes. Then he drove to Burlington. The administrator at Jonah's facility, a man named Garvey with the nervous energy of someone unaccustomed to being in trouble, had Colton in his office for 11 minutes. In that time, Colton wrote a check for 8 years of Jonah's care, upgraded Jonah to a private room with a south-facing window overlooking the grounds, assigned the senior physiotherapist, and explained with quiet precision what would happen to the facility's accreditation if Jonah received anything less than the standard of care Colton was paying for. "His sister handles the billing," Garvey said, dabbing his forehead. "She'll see the balance. Tell her it was an anonymous grant. Healthcare Foundation. If my name appears anywhere in this conversation, I will have this facility reviewed by 3 separate regulatory bodies before summer." Colton paused at the door. "See that the window faces the garden. He should have afternoon light." He was back on the highway and calling Nash before he cleared Burlington. The development group that bought the building at 84 Pelham Avenue in Weston. "Find the principal." Nash came back in under 10 minutes. The company was Strata Group, Inc. The owner was a man named Warren Croft, who made his money buying rental buildings, applying maximum rent increases to force out existing tenants, and flipping the units to condominium conversions. "You want me to do something about him?" Nash asked. Colton stared at the February highway, unspooling ahead of him toward the city. "Call Hendricks at the trust. I want to buy Strata Group's outstanding debt, whatever they're carrying. Find out who their lenders are, and make offers. I want controlling interest by Friday. That's a hostile acquisition of a mid-level property firm." That's the idea. She found out on a Thursday. It was 6:15 in the evening, the office quiet, when Thea pushed open his door without knocking. She was holding a printed statement from the Burlington facility. Her face was flushed, her chest was moving fast, the way it did when she'd walked hard and far without slowing down for anything. "Close the door," Colton said calmly. She kicked it shut and crossed the room and dropped the paper on his desk. "Anonymous grant," she said. The words came out controlled and precise, the way his did when he was most serious. "Healthcare Foundation." Garvey sounded like he was reading from a script with a gun to his head. She leaned over the desk. "Who else in this city writes checks that terrify people into accepting them? That's excellent news, you must feel." "Don't." Her hands planted flat on the leather blotter. She was close enough that he could smell her perfume, Something understated, cedar, and something clean. Do not manage me right now. You paid for 8 years of my brother's care. You bought me. I told you I would not be that person. I protected a professional asset. I told you I didn't want to owe you. Her voice cracked on the last word, only slightly, only for a moment. She pushed off the desk and paced to the window. I have watched you do exactly this. I have watched you extend resources and collect obligations. I have watched 3 clients believe they were getting help and discover later they were getting a leash. She spun around. What's the price? My silence. You've had that for 3 years. My loyalty. You already had that too. So what is it, Colton? What do you want from me? He stood up. He walked around the desk slowly and stopped in front of her. Nothing that can be paid back, he said. That's not an answer. It is. He stopped close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze. The city was going dark and pink behind her. I found you shivering in a parking garage because you were too proud to ask for help from anyone. I found out you'd been eating granola bars for lunch so your brother could have physiotherapy twice a week. He said it without gentleness. Because she didn't want gentleness, she wanted truth laid flat, the same way she always did. That is not a liability. He stopped. She waited. I have trusted you with things I don't trust to anyone, he said. 3 years of case strategy, client confidence, every decision I made before I made it publicly. I trusted you completely, and I was too absorbed in my own operation to notice that the person I trusted most was disappearing right in front of me. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face, his knuckles grazing her cheek. She went very still. This was not a business calculation, Thea. Then what was it? It was me refusing to let you vanish. His hand settled at the back of her neck. Her pulse was rapid under his thumb. Stop calculating the debt. There isn't one. What I want from you cannot be structured into an agreement. She looked up at him. Her voice dropped to almost nothing. Then what is it? I want you to stop surviving, he said, low and deliberate. And I want to be the reason you start living. She didn't move for a long moment. Then she reached up and took hold of his lapel, and she didn't let go. 3 weeks later, the boardroom on 42 was cold with purpose. Thea sat at the far end of the table, notepad open, pen ready. At the other end sat Warren Croft, the principal of Strata Group, flanked by 2 lawyers who had clearly not been told enough. They thought they were here for a standard acquisition meeting with Apollo Holdings, a name that appeared on no public registration they'd been able to find. Colton walked in and did not sit. Mr. Croft, he said, as of this morning, Morrow & Associates holds controlling interest in Strata Group's primary debt and has exercised the purchase option on your 3 largest lender agreements. We own 68% of your operating liability. He opened the folder Thea had prepared at 6 that morning before he had arrived. In practical terms, you work for me now. Croft went the color of old concrete. He looked down the length of the table. Thea looked back at him with the detached, professional clarity of a woman watching a problem get resolved. Colton slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany. That's a resignation. You're forfeiting your severance and stepping down as principal, effective today. If you contest it, I'll have our forensic accountant deliver a detailed account of the tenant harassment complaints your management company buried over the past 3 years directly to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. He placed his knuckles on the table and leaned forward, very slightly. Sign it, Mr. Croft. Croft's hand shook so badly his lawyer had to steady the paper. He signed. When they shuffled out, Colton walked the length of the table and dropped the signed resignation onto Thea's notepad. Filing, he said quietly. Thea looked at the signature. Then she looked up at him, and something moved through her expression. Not gratitude exactly, something fiercer than that, something that looked like recognition. Red folder, she said. Red folder. On a Saturday in early March, the last of the Toronto ice was retreating from the sidewalks in Grey Rivers when Colton pulled up to the curb outside the Wellington Street building. Thea came out in a cream sweater and dark jeans, and she looked different, rested, solid, like a woman who had slept in a real bed for 3 consecutive weeks and no longer needed to pretend she hadn't. They drove to Burlington in easy silence. The drive was mostly quiet, but it wasn't the careful silence of 2 people managing what they said. It was the silence of people who had stopped performing for each other. Jonah's room was on the south side of the facility, with the large window Colton had specified. The winter light came through clearly and lay in pale rectangles across the floor. He was propped up in his bed, clean and calm, a nurse sitting in the recliner with a book. Thea walked in and stopped. She crossed the room slowly and took her brother's hand. Jonah's eyes found her face. He couldn't track perfectly, couldn't speak, but something in his expression eased. the small, unmistakable softening of someone who felt safe. Colton stood in the doorway and did not move. Thea pressed her lips to her brother's forehead. She whispered something too quiet to carry across the room. She held his hand for a long time, long enough that the nurse slipped quietly past Colton and into the hallway to give them privacy. Long enough that the afternoon light shifted a few degrees across the floor. Finally, she stood up. She kissed Jonah's forehead once more and walked to the door. She stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind her. Her eyes were red, but her face was clear in a way he had never seen before. Like a storm had passed so completely there wasn't even a memory of cloud. "He has a window," she said softly. Her voice barely held. "I used to tell him about the window in our old apartment, the one that faced the park." She stopped. "He can see the trees from here." "I asked for south-facing," Colton said. "Better light in the afternoon." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up, took hold of the lapels of his overcoat, and pulled him down to her. She kissed him the way she did everything that mattered. Without performance, without hesitation, entirely and completely. It was the collision of two people who understood the exact brutal cost of surviving a world designed to grind you down, and the rarer, more difficult thing of choosing to trust someone with the pieces that remained. He caught her waist and held on. When they broke apart, his hands were still on her hips, and the Burlington hallway was very quiet. "You're not my assistant, Thea," he said, not gently, with the same flat certainty he brought to every important statement he had ever made. She looked up at him. "Then what am I?" "The only person in this city I trust completely." He held her gaze, "my anchor." She was quiet for a moment, then the corner of her mouth curved, not the polished professional smile she kept for the 42nd floor, but a real one, small and private and entirely hers. "You're still paying me a salary," she said. "Obviously." They walked out of the facility together into the pale March light, and for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, Thea Dunbar was not running a calculation. She was not tallying deficits or rationing meals or bracing for the next thing the city was going to take from her. She was just walking. And beside her, a man who had spent 20 years building walls around everything that mattered to him was, quietly and without announcement, letting one of them come down.